Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to have Sara Jackson with us today. She's a geography lecturer at Metropolitan State University in Denver. She's been there since 2015. She has a PhD in geography from York University in Toronto. And she was also an English lecturer at the National University of Mongolia in 2009. Her research is on political ecology of mining and infrastructure. And she's also interested in sustainable neighborhoods in Denver, and that's research she does with her students. She has various publications in Geoforum, Nationalities Papers, and the Journal of Eurasian Geography and Economics, for instance. And so please help me welcome Sara.
Thank you, Franck. Hello. Thank you for the invitation to speak to the Mongolia Studies Initiative. So just a quick question. Do people in the room have a Mongolia Studies background or geography background? A little bit? Okay. All right. So I'll provide some background. So as Franck mentioned, I do research on mining issues. And specifically, my research has been on infrastructure development related to the Oyu Tolgoi copper gold mine in Mongolia's South Gobi province. So I'm really interested in how mining infrastructure transforms relationships between people, land, and the environment, and some of the controversies and policies related to that. So this is kind of structure of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about mining in Mongolia and some of the historical context. I'll talk about something called the hydrosocial cycle, which is a really big part of political ecology of water debates. I'll talk a little bit about the environmental context in Mongolia, and then I'll talk about two pipelines, basically, water pipelines related to Oyu Tolgoi. So, Mongolia, right? And the area in southern Gobi of Mongolia, there's a lot of mining that's been going on. So this gives you a sense, this is from 2012, of the mining leases in southern Mongolia. The active leases are in dark brown. The application leases are in red. The exploration leases, again, this is a number of years old, are in orange, and the tendered bid leases are tan. The kind of hash green areas are special protected areas, and then any white space is sort of just land available for nomadic herding and other purposes. The license circled in blue, that's Oyu Tolgoi. So my field work I conducted between 2010 and 2015 in Mongolia, and particularly in South Gobi province and Dornogov. And my focus was mostly in Hangbogd, which is the Sum or county where Oyu Tolgoi is located. And Oyu Tolgoi is only about 80 kilometers or so from the Chinese border. So I did a number of interviews, focus groups, over 100 with herders, NGOs, government officials, and mining company staff, as well as consultants, and document analysis. So nomadic herders are a really important part of the story of what's happening in South Gobi province. Certainly they've been romanticized as being, as having traditional lifestyles in the area, but of course they experienced a lot of modernization during the socialist era, as well as today with things like, sit down? Okay, I can stand a little closer, as we have, right, our solar panel. And I think that is really important to talk about the modernity of nomadic herders, particularly because when people talk about problems related to the pasture in Mongolia, it's sometimes associated with blaming the herders rather than privatization, which has had a lot of damaging effects to the pasture in Mongolia. So a little context of the transition from democracy, or to democracy, from communism also ushered in an era of capitalism that has had a really radical transformation throughout the country. There was a lot of urban to rural migration after the transition to democracy, which also at the same time we saw kind of a disassembly of the management of pasture land. And what happened were, in especially 99 to 2001, were dzud, which is a kind of environmental catastrophe. Could be drought, could also be really cold, hard snows in the wintertime that make it really difficult for the livestock to eat grasses. So we see really big spikes in the die-off of livestock in the 21st century. So while we see these changes happening to nomadic herders, there's also been a skyrocketing of investment in the mineral sector. So here's just a graph showing the increase in foreign direct investment from, basically you can see from around 2009 to 2013, 2014, there was an incredible jump in the amount of foreign direct investment. And a lot of this was connected to the signing of the Oyu Tolgoi copper mine agreement. There have been other mines in Mongolia, of course. There's the Erdenet copper mine in northern Mongolia. There's many coal mines. There's uranium mining. And mining took place during the Soviet era as well, for sure. But Oyu Tolgoi mining in Mongolia. And it's definitely been a known resource for a long time. Oyu means turquoise. Tolgoi means hill. So Turquoise Hill. And when you have turquoise, that means you have copper. So there's definitely been this known resource. But there was a lot of exploration of this area in the early 2000s, and an agreement was signed in 2009 between the Mongolian government and Ivanhoe Mines, which is a Canadian company, in Rio Tinto, which manages the mine. And it's been a subject of a lot of controversy as well as excitement in Mongolia and around the world about investing in Mongolia. So here's a satellite image from Google Earth. And the open pit began exports in 2013. And the underground mine, which is where the real money is for the gold and copper, is expected to open in the early 2000s. And here's just another view. This is from 2012 of the construction of the open pit. So there's been a lot of promises associated with the Oyu Tolgoi copper mine. A lot about economic development, about nation building. These are signs, billboards from Ulaanbaatar, the capital, from 2012. A lot of promises about protecting the environment and bringing best practices of the the international mining business to Mongolia. There's a lot of excitement about what types of improved processes we can see in Mongolia. There's been a lot of concern about the environment and how mining companies treat water resources, what's happening to the pasture land. So Oyu Tolgoi tries to promote itself as a means to improve mining processes.
How is this related to mining?
This is the mining company. This is one of their posters. And here they're doing basically seedling plantings for reclamation. So they're saying we're going to reclaim. Yeah. So that's a great question. So that's something that they promote a lot, is this environmental restoration of the land. Yeah, and so that's what this says is the best reclamation technology. As I mentioned, within the political ecology of water literature, a lot of attention is paid to the hydrosocial cycle, which is basically the idea of, rather than just thinking about water as this measurable, abstract thing, to consider what's the relationship to society. And so Linton and Buds have this really simple version of water being something that's produced by technology, social power, and structure, as well as, of course, right, it as a chemical, H2O. And this is a strong reaction to the hydrologic cycle model that we learn in school. You know, it rains, the water flows into the rivers and streams, etc. So part of the discussion is then an idea of modern water. And this is an idea that Linton talks a lot about. This idea that water is removed from its natural and cultural context, that it's channelized and redirected and becomes this homogeneous thing we call water, and abstracted into a commodity to reproduce capital. So this frames a lot of, I think, the problems between, or the tensions that we see in Mongolia between local populations, the government, and mining companies, is how do we talk about this resource? What does this resource mean? How should it be measured? These are really big questions that are the source of a lot of controversy and tension. And then on the far, that's your right, that's a picture of one of the pipelines I'm going to be talking about in a minute. So this sets the stage for these pipelines. So just to give you a sense about Hungbog Sum's climate, it's Gobi Desert, so as you imagine, it's quite dry. Here's an image from, this is 2011, it's actually quite a bit bigger now, the Sum Center. So for Mongolia, very high temperatures. Hungbog is, I think it's Mongolia's hottest Sum. So into the 80s in the summers, and then a balmy only zeros in the wintertime, pretty warm actually compared to some places, and very low levels of precipitation, only 3 to 7 inches per year, and that's pretty variable throughout the region. And we can also talk about the different types of vegetation. So these large trees, they're Hylos, Siberian elms. I think they're beautiful. They grow in the ephemeral river channels. And then Zag on your right, often used for firewood. And then there's also beautiful vegetation like the Siberian iris in the springtime. So I want to read you a passage from a Mongolian geography book on the Gobi that talks about extending the pasture, because taking land that is, wild and making it suitable for human habitation, of course, is an important part of geography, but also an important part of state building in Mongolia. So the passage from Basan is, a long time ago, large intestine worms, prozhevalkis, wonder geckos, and so-called yeti, a savage family of animals that do not exist, lived in this waterless, desolate place. During the socialist era, wells were created, and animal families settled so that they could take advantage of resources throughout the pasture. So actually even Ogedei Khan, one of his decrees was to build wells to extend the pasture. So extending the pasture through well building is a really important part of Mongolian history. I also like that they include the Mongolian deathworm and the yeti in this passage. I'm a fan of cryptozoology. So that building of wells is really important and was certainly a goal under socialism in the 1970s. That was the main concern of the government in the provincial capital in Dalanzagad, was to extend the pasture by building wells. So here's an example of a shallow herder's well. And here's a local spring, Bakbolok. And some of the elderly residents who live in this area have talked about how in the 60s and 70s, when the state was building a lot of wells, they actually saw some draining of local springs, that a lot of local springs and rivers, or streams, I should say, dried up. So seeing a decreasing amount of water resources in the area is actually nothing new. So during decollectivization in the 1990s, yeah?
How is that well powered?
This one, that one, it's not electric. I think that's one, lower bucket down, kind. Yeah. Some are have generators though, and some have pumps. Yeah. where was I? Oh, yeah. So in the 1990s with decollectivization, there was some privatization of the wells, and of course the lack of investment in shared resources, which we saw throughout Mongolia in terms of collecting fodder and transporting animals. All of that kind of disappeared for the herders. There's also a concern about climate change in the region. Mongolia has seen a 2-degree increase. People talk about colder, harder rains that come less frequently. People talk about decreased surface waters that they used to use year-round, or maybe they would freeze in the winter but are no longer available. People talk about raising fewer livestock. And one herder told me how there were stories about how grass used to grow on camels' backs, which I think is a kind of fun way to imagine a wetter time. So that's the environmental context for what I want to talk about next, which is the 2 pieces of infrastructure that Oyu Tolgoi has built to make the mine possible. Because you have to have water for a mine. You can't do mining without water. So bringing water to the mine is really, really important. So I'm going to talk about the Gobi Desert aquifer pipeline, which brings water to the mine. And I'm going to talk about the Undine River diversion, which moves water away from the mine. So how much water does Oyu Tolgoi need? Well, it is allowed 870 liters per second of, and they're using this water that they're taking from the Gobi Desert aquifer for industrial water. Water that's used for the people working there actually comes from a different source. And they actually also, at least when I was doing research there last, were bringing in a lot of bottled water as well for consumption. So basically, you need a lot of water because you're taking this ore out of the ground. You need to crush it, and you have to find a way to separate the copper and the gold from the rest of the rock. So you mix the crushed ore with water and other chemicals to separate them out. And then all of the concentrate, so the copper and the gold concentrate, is sent to China for smelting. So none of the smelting is happening in Mongolia. And so here's just a picture from Oyu Tolgoi of their processing. So the Gobi Desert aquifer is this blue zone located about 10 kilometers to the northwest of the license area. And it's about 45 kilometers long and 12.5 kilometers wide. And the wells for this are either 100 to 500 meters deep, so pretty far in the ground, whereas the herder wells that I was showing before are 3 to 10 meters deep. So according to Oyu Tolgoi, there's enough water in the aquifer to last 30 years of mine operations. But when I was talking to an official from the Ministry of Environment of South Gobi, he said probably more 10 to 15 years. And the World Bank has a similar estimate. So there's some debate on how much water can be provided. There is groundwater in the area, so that water, so the groundwater in the Hongbo Basin is what people use, and that's what the mine also uses that for, like, people's consumption. Although people say it's very hojerte, which means it has a lot of minerals in it, and maybe not that healthy. But this water coming from the aquifer is like brackish. It's fossil water. Yeah, so it's only useful for industrial purposes, and they say for livestock as well. Or at least the mining company says that. So here's a picture. These are from 2011. This is one of the pumping stations, and here's the pipeline as it was being laid. This was from May 2011. So because this is considered a self-discovered source, Oyu Tolgoi funded the exploration for it. They have the right to use it to meet the project demands. And if they discover more, then the state has the right to sell that excess to other entities. So the state has some incentive to get other people to explore for water resources. So water is public property in Mongolia. Land ownership doesn't necessarily equal water rights, which is a little bit different than what we have here. And Oyu Tolgoi pays fees to the state. But part of the investment agreement that was signed in 2009 means that water fees are tax deductible, and they get rewards for recycling technology. And since they recycle 80% of their industrial water, they're able to basically avoid paying those fees to the state. And the state also requires that Oyu Tolgoi provides public access to the water that they're pumping. So here you can see this is a trough for livestock, and that sort of hook-like thing coming off of the pumping station is where the water's coming out for the livestock. So the local government does have some say in water usage, but not for large-scale demands of water. So any users who are consuming over 100 cubic meters per day, the central government basically has control over that decision. So that's part of a lot of the consternation, is that the local population, the local government says, but we should have the rights to say who can and can't use the water, but the central government in their water law has overridden that. And just a note, I'm talking more about the water law from 2014. There's been some updates since 2013, but in terms of a lot of my research, the 2004 law is more relevant, for those who are wondering. So here's a picture of, more pictures of the construction. So some of the herders' major concerns are that the amount of water in the well is decreasing, and the wells are decreasing. So herders say that 300 to 400 camels used to be able to consume the water, but now maybe a well will only provide enough water to 10 to 20 camels. And OT says this is because, or Oyu Tolgoi says this is because the wells are filled with dust and sand, but the herders get really upset when Oyu Tolgoi tells them that, because they say, no, we know how to clean our wells. That's not what the problem is. The problem is that the amount of water going down. So they don't believe the company, one, because they're taking measurements in different ways. And so how people understand the amount of water in a well is different, and there's a miscommunication there. There's also an issue that many of the herders don't believe there's separation between the deep aquifer and the shallow wells. So Oyu Tolgoi now says that there may be some connection between the deep aquifer, Guniholoi, and the shallow wells, but there's an aqualute, a clay layer, that's supposed to be separating it. So when you drill a deep well, there's not supposed to be any leakage from the surface groundwater below. But that's how people understand the hydrology of it in the location. And that's in part because there are some wells that have like a dripping sound, and they're called the cascading wells, which were early bore wells that Oyu Tolgoi drilled. And they were maybe done not properly. And it's been a big debate between the company and the local population to have those wells closed off. They've actually caused a lot of distrust, and one NGO called Ich Gobios, Big Gobi water formed because of that controversy. So there's been a lot of meetings about approval, and some herders told me about an 18-hour meeting with the company, and nothing ever came of it. And there's also a lot of perceptions of corruption related particularly to this pipeline. So the approval was given in May, and so the approval was given while I was there taking these pictures, but the pipeline construction began in February. So what the herders told me, and some construction workers for Oyu Tolgoi told me, was that the local government wasn't going to give the permit for this infrastructure. So the central government sent someone who was not from South Gobi to approve it on behalf of the central government, and then that same person was given a contract to do construction for the mine. So there's definitely the sense of conflict of interests involved in this process. There's also issues in the environmental impact assessment. There was a lack of baseline studies done for the environmental impact assessment, and there are various issues that the company said might happen, including failure of wells and reduced water sources. But there was also concern about the timing of the environmental impact assessment. The release of the assessment wasn't until 2012, at the end of 2012, and that was associated with the billions of dollars in loans that Oyu Tolgoi got from the World Bank and the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, as well as the Canadian government as well. And so the ESI, or the complete environmental social impact assessment wasn't released until the mine had already been under construction, which normally you're supposed to have all your documents released and then you begin construction. So there's all these future tense statements. It's like, well, maybe that should be past tense in the impact assessment. So according to the agreement and law, Oyu Tolgoi can't decrease access of water to herders and livestock. So they have a monitoring program, and Oyu Tolgoi claims this is going very well. But as I said before, there's this general sense that it's not working and that people are decreasing the amount of animals that they're herding, and that there's questions about the future of nomadic herding in the area. And a former local government official told me that he sees it as that there's this potential of the area being a casualty for the Mongolian economy, saying that he's not sure if that's right, but that it's necessary. And other officials have called for, he and other officials have called for renegotiating water rights. And there's also this sense that there's a lot of national security issues involved, both for the economy as well as because you're talking about water. So security and sacrifice are big themes in the area related to this pipeline. So the other pipeline is the Undine River diversion pipeline. So here's a picture of the Undine. This is below the mining license. So the Undine River is an ephemeral river. It's about 120 kilometers long with a 1,000-kilometer square catchment area. And here's a high-loss forest. People are concerned that the forest is dying. Some people say it's because of mining activities. Some people say climate change. Some people say because the livestock are eating the shoots of the new trees. So there's some debate about the health of the forest. So here's a map. The red arrow that I have is basically where the Undine River runs. And so where it intersects the mining license, that area needed to be diverted, because its original path ran through what is now the open pit and under the waste rock pile. So Oyu Tolgoi said, okay, well, we have to divert this stream. So it's been diverted through a pipe, and so there's a dam in that red box there in order to relocate it around the open pit and the waste rock pile. So some potential concerns are about increased evaporation, changes in the sediment downstream, effects on aquifer recharge are actually unknown. And so it's diverted by a 100-millimeter pipe. So it's supposed to contain 1,000-year floods. And about 6 kilometers of the river has been dried up. And there's now a relocation of the Borovo Spring, so this is the fence of the mining license. And the relocated Borovo Spring is inside that fence. And so this was a really important, the original Borovo Spring was a really important cultural area. There was really good pasture there. It's where people had nadam. And the relocation is a little bit less aesthetically pleasing. If you can remember back to the slide I have of Bakboluk, it's kind of a pretty area. And now it's fenced off, so sometimes people climb the fence and open the valve to let water out for livestock. There's also been some concern about the geology underneath, if it's supporting the water in the same way as the old location in order for it to be a proper spring. So this has been really controversial move. So in Mongolia, while I was doing my research, there was the development of a new law referred to as the Long Name Law, which has to do with prohibiting mining activities in forests and river areas and water. And the Undine was exempt from that because it's considered an important part of national security. Oyu Tolgoi is a strategic deposit, which means that it produces 5% or more of the country's GDP. And so it's viewed as a really important national economic interest to have this mine be successful. So they need to have, they made this exemption for the strategic deposits. So the impacts were allowed on the Undine River. So the diversion began in 2012, and there's been a lot of local opposition since. The last time I was in Hangbog, I talked to the then Sum governor, and he was really upset about it and still hadn't signed off on the diversion, even though it had been completed several years before. And interestingly, when I talked to some of the cultural heritage consultants, they said that they were told not to ask too much about the Undine, that it was something to just not talk to people about. So the company was sort of knew that what they were doing was going to make people unhappy. So there's a really wonderful story that explains the national significance of the river that an elderly herder in the area told me. And that is that when Genghis Khan's mercenaries were crossing the Gobi Desert, they were dying of thirst. Their horses were dying of thirst. And then they came upon the Undine River, and it saved their lives. So they built an ovo, so a stack of cairns, and told the government about that, about the river saving their lives. So the government then, every year, would do a ceremony and give an offering of silver yembu, or bullion, to the river. And then one time, a messenger stole the silver yembu, and the river dried up and stopped running. And so she told this as a story about the important environmental ethos of Mongolia, and of course the national significance tying it to Genghis Khan. Also of importance is the name, because Undine comes from Undach, which means to drink. So this is the drinking river. And sometimes it's referred to the Undai, but it's the Undine. The herders were very specific with me that that's how it should be called. So this story is often used in complaints against Oyu Tolgoi as sort of a symbol of the issue of lack of informed consent. And in 2015, people were really desperate for water. They kept drilling wells near the Undine, and there was no water coming up. And Oyu Tolgoi was helping them, and they couldn't, even with their machinery, they couldn't find water. So on the far right, that's a picture of an area where they tried to drill and it was unsuccessful. And then here, the company gave this herder, or loaned them a container for their animals, although the herder said, oh no, there's something weird with the water because of the metal, like it was giving the camel lesions or something like that. And I actually have a picture too from someone sent me that winter, and this is like insulated. It was kind of a funny picture, like they wrapped it up so the water wouldn't freeze in the winter. So this has been an ongoing issue, and I think it's still an issue of this water delivery method because of the lack of water in the wells. So overall, there's been a lack of informed consent in the region, and there are still complaints being lodged, still debates happening. A tripart council was formed between the company, the herders, and the local government to try to come to some agreement, and there's been some other attempts at mediation, but there's still this sense of can you have nomadic herding and mining in this region together? And that's a big question that people have. So, I think this story is really important also for showing the privatization of resources of water through mining, of abstracting them. And even though the water is still owned by the state, it's certainly being used for different purposes, for capital generation. And the central state is definitely facilitating this mining process through the use of water. It's interesting, former President Elbig Dorj wanted to declare water resources as strategic deposits, which I find pretty interesting as a way to protect them and to think about resources in water resources in a similar vein as mining. Sorry for the pun. And also the newer water laws from 2013 state that basically you have to have really increased permission from the central government if you're a foreigner doing research on water. So all of the foreign water exploration companies have left the country. So this has been another interesting way of controlling water resources to control the mining. And I should say the comment about Elbig Dorj and the strategic deposits, that was a proposed minerals law, not water law. As for the future of herding in the region, that's a big question across Mongolia. Lots of people have been studying how not only mining affecting the future of herding, but also capitalism in general has created a lot of instabilities for nomadic herders. And being a part of the global marketplace is changing the opportunities that people have. And so we'll have to see what happens there. So hopefully this gives you a sense of these changing relationships between people, water, and place in South Gobi province in Mongolia. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. It's wonderful to hear this. Must be very difficult to do the fieldwork to begin with.
It was all right. Yeah.
I'm just curious.
I enjoyed it.
A lot of this routes are familiar, but then also very, very different.
Right.
From where I do my work in Mongolia. It's just one, starting point. You started with saying, well, we shouldn't really romanticize this so-called nomadic pastoralism. But then you ended with, well, what's the nomadic herders? How nomadic are they now, after all? So I'm just curious, as a reference point to compare with the herders that I know in Mongolia.
Yeah. So they don't migrate as often or as far.
Right.
So maybe only twice a year instead of 4 times a year, and maybe only even a few kilometers instead of hundreds of kilometers. Because of the lack of pasture. Because so many areas, and because if we go back to the mining license picture, and there's more roads and infrastructure since then, I mean, there's just not a lot of space anymore. And of course, you need a lot of area. People actually talk about wanting fencing, which is really interesting because of all the research on Inner Mongolia and the effects of fencing on pasture land. But people have said they want fences. Because that way they have, that's their area, and they think that will somehow make it possible for them to continue.
Because they want to fend off outsiders from invading into their pasture. Is that why?
Well, or at least to give a sense of there's not as much overlap. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't put it as, because people talk about how sensitive this is because it's their family and friends, right? That they're encountering, tensions over space. So they don't want to fight with them because it's their, we're talking about a couple thousand people. So people really know each other very well. And certainly in the bogs, which is the sort of division under the SUM. So I think it's just a way of allocating space that they see as, some people see as an option. But people want more wells, right? They want to continue. But yeah, hopefully I didn't romanticize it too much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It was a good question. Hi, Susan.
I actually follow up on the fencing question. I noticed in both the Borovo Spring and then also the one that Oyu Tolgoi had put in, they had fences around them.
Yeah.
And is that a common practice? And I guess also sort of, I haven't ever really thought about water as a sort of communal resource, but going back to the collectivized era and then beyond that, earlier than that, like how was water dispersion handled as sort of a community resource? And have you seen, like, do you think there are changes in ways that people are using or drawing on that history to argue against some of the things that the mining companies are saying? That was many questions.
Oh, no, it's okay. I've got a pen. So as far as the fencing goes, I mean, I think in Bagbolag, it's just a way of kind of containing the space, but this is just a public area right next to the SUM Center where people can go. And I'm trying to remember, yeah, I mean, it is fenced off a little bit, so you could close people off, but it's definitely a public space, for sure. And some of that's just like to keep trash out and, you know, stuff like that. People complain a lot about trash in waterways because there's more people and more stuff. So I think that's part of that. For the Oyu Tolgoi Borovo Spring, it was not fenced, and so people would talk about, especially right after it was fenced off, people were like, oh yeah, we used to go there, but now it's fenced off. Like, we can't go there. So I was just reading an article yesterday about this, about how people violate that, though. They climb the fence and open the tap, and, you know, so the company's trying to control people's water usage. And they'll often say that in terms of, well, we don't want them to use too much water, you don't want them to have too many livestock, because then they're going to overgraze, right? So that kind of trope of overgrazing comes in a lot. And I'm trying to remember when I was at Hottenboluk in Durunagov, I don't think that one was fenced, although they kind of created this cement wall for it. So does that answer your question about the fences adequately? Okay. So for the building of more wells, so I did interview someone who in the 70s, he worked for the provincial government, and he said that was like the government, they would go out and they would build wells. That was like what the Ministry of Environment basically was doing in the 70s, was building wells to extend the pasture and just to, you know, create as much area as possible. So that's where a lot of those wells come from. And they were communal. And so there still are communal wells, but there is an incentive, and I think I have it, for people to build new wells. I think, where is that? Did I include that? Oh, I don't have that in my notes anymore. But basically, the government will give you X number, 1,000 tugriks to, or a percentage of the amount to build a well, and then you pay the rest. And so I think that one of the critiques of governance of the area is that there is no more control over the pasture, and so there's a sense, well, the SUM government needs to kind of start working on this more to organize people so that there's no issues with overgrazing and so that we have the right amount of wells. But there is this kind of sense of, well, Oyu Tolgoi is the government now because they have so much control over knowledge and equipment and space. People definitely want more wells, but the company says, no, you shouldn't have wells there. Like even where the Guni Hole aquifer is, there's only a few like camel wells there, and people are like, oh great, now we can have more wells in that area. But then the company says, no, you shouldn't do that. So that's part of that tension too, is the company telling no to people, and they're like, but you took away our land and our water, is how they feel, I think. So that's part of that. Does that answer? Okay. Yeah.
You said something at some point about the rights to water and the ownership of land does not necessarily align, and I was interested to know a bit more on that. And also I wondered whether there was also a misalignment between ground and subsoil.
Mm-hmm.
Whether say something about that.
Yeah. So my understanding is all water in Mongolia is public, just like all land is public land, right? Unless you fence it off, right? Then it becomes privatized. So the water that Oyu Tolgoi uses is state property, right? So they're just paying a fee. So there's that aspect of it. And then, so is there a difference in the water law between the sort of surface and deeper aquifer water?
I mean, presumably the land they have
Right.
in mind is delimited, right? There's
Yeah.
there's a clear boundary, but
Yep.
then the water moves differently. So I'm just
Yeah.
wondering about how this mismatch.
Oh, well, I mean, that, I'm not sure I would have to look into that. I mean, because that's an issue anywhere, right? That you're only allowed to draw so much water. And I don't know as much about, like, let me get to a map. I need my maps. There we go. Actually, I have a different map that might be useful. Because this is all the water sources. So these would be the water sources that they're able to draw from, right, for that kind of domestic use. The water from Guni Holoi, though, is not supposed to be connected to any other water sources. So it might be, but because it's separated, there's no consideration for that multidimensional movement of water, right? Because it's supposed to be isolated. And the company has the rights to that 870 seconds, or 870 liters per second for 30 years for Guni Holoi. So they don't have to consider, the movement of the water, although that has been more recently subject to debate that it might be connected to another aquifer and might be affecting that other aquifer. So that, and then the water within the mining license, that I think they're paying fees on. I would have to look into that. They don't talk about that. That's not as documented as much that I remember. I'd have to look at it though. But yeah, that groundwater connection issue is kind of fuzzy. And that's what the herders are concerned about, that it's all connected. And that's why they're seeing less water. But the company says it's not.
Any more questions? Can I just follow up? How does that differ from mining elsewhere? Because the fact that it's kind of, the land is not owned, or the water is not owned, does that differ? Does that give a different dimension to the mining operation?
Well, the closest thing that I know more about would be like fracking in Colorado, so you have different ownership rights, right? Whether you own the mineral rights and the water rights, and there's issues with farmers, right? And the farmers who own their mineral and water rights are fine with fracking because they get so much money, right, from the companies. And in that case, if you're going to frack on a farm, the farmer probably has the water rights, which could be 100-year-old water rights in Colorado. So the farmer can make a lot of money off of those water rights, and the state isn't really involved in that situation. Here, though, you have the state being the owner of the water rights, and so then, and in Colorado, I think if the state owned the water rights, they would probably want to sell it and make some money because we have a lot of budgetary constraints in Colorado. But here you have an incentive written into the investment agreement for the company to keep exploring, because then the state can sell the water that the company doesn't need, So it's a pretty different dynamic when you have, I think, the state owning it versus the farmers. Because if you compare the farmers in Colorado and the herders in Mongolia, the farmers in Colorado, I mean, that's their retirement plan, is selling their water rights to either a city or an oil and gas company. And in Mongolia, they don't have that control over their water resources. Not that I'm advocating for privatization of water, but it's just a different, who's controlling that water is a pretty big issue. Any questions? All right, great, thank you very much.